everyone. Shana Tova. Sorry for the wait. We were holding off because we figured that some of you who were in the library with Rabbi Lakitz would come in here, and so we wanted to make sure. It's a small group. This is a new thing we're trying. The Ayla Eskara service is part of the afternoon liturgy for Yom Kippur. And in a traditional service with a traditional machzor, it would be in Musaf. So Musaf is the additional service, usually in the morning. But actually, because these services are so long, it could be in the early part of the afternoon or later. So for us, we thought, well, let's just take a look at it. This book is the first one of our Reform prayer books, Machzorim, to have the martyrology in it. So I thought it'd be interesting for us to take a look at it and see what it is. Even though we're standing up here and it feels formal, if you have something you'd like to say, that would be fine. Just in terms of what this is. So Ayla Eskara is a medieval poem, and it was based on midrashim, so rabbinic commentaries from the 5th and 6th centuries. Hold on, one sec, time out. If you do that in the hall, that would be so much better. Mac is helping me find readers, but in the hall would be better than in here. So the Ayla Eskara is this medieval poem, and it was based on midrashim from the 5th and 6th centuries. So if we think about that in terms of where Jews were, it recounts the martyrdom of 10 rabbis who were executed by Rome. So this was following the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. And actually, so we pretty much know that from that period on, things are not good for Jews in Europe. So this is the beginning of the exile time. So these midrashim detail the rabbis' deaths by various kinds of torture. And they're sometimes pretty graphic, and some of you may have heard these stories when you were younger. I mean, there was a Rabbi Akiva story that everybody seems to know, but we're going to actually read. That one is the only gory one that we're going to read. But these are stories of what are usually held up as martyrs. So these are people who died in service to Judaism, or in serving the Jewish people, or in serving some kind of Jewish ideal by refusing to disobey a Jewish law, right? So that's this concept. In some cases, the Jewish law that they were doing was just teaching Torah, was just being Jews. So the poem begins, Ayla Eskara v'nafshi alai ashpeka, these I remember and I pour out my soul, which is a verse from Lamentations. So we're going to look first at the story of Akiva, because as I said, it's the best known, and it's in this book. So if you turn to page 520, so Rabbi Akiva was one of the 10, a man of piety and humility, spiritual leader of the Jewish community in the land of Israel, supporter of the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome that began in 132 CE, who openly defied the Roman decree against assembling in synagogues and teaching Torah. So of Akiva ben Yosef, we are told, when time came to say the morning Shema, the Roman executioners were combing Akiva's flesh with iron. And he said, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one," the Shema. Akiva's students asked him, "Rabbi, even now?" And he said, "All my life I have been troubled that I could not obey this verse, love Adonai with all your soul," which is to say, love God even when God takes your soul. And I have wondered, when will I be able to fulfill this mitzvah? Now this moment has come, how can I not obey? Akiva stretched out the affirmation of divine unity, the word echad, until the departure of his soul, and he died with echad upon his lips. Rabbi Akiva would teach, human beings were made in God's image as an act of love. So if you've ever heard the idea that a Jew should die with the Shema on their lips, that's what he had heard, he had heard that we should love God with all our soul, but that idea of this is the last thing that we say, that this should be our very last words, this is a story that illustrates that point in a pretty graphic way, and this is why, we teach this we continue to tell this story because it's such a provocative picture with someone who's dying and whose last words that God is one. So I don't know if you've ever processed this story before and how it makes you feel, but we're going to take a look at, or we're going to sort of talk about why are we telling these stories on Yom Kippur? Are they supposed to make us feel better or worse? So before we continue on, just a little bit more background. Ayla Eskara contains this kind of material, portraits of 10 sages martyred for practicing Judaism and exemplifying Jewish values, as I said, while living under hostile and dangerous regimes. Many questions have been asked about this liturgical poem. Is it historically accurate? How is it theologically? Is this our theology? The function of including this poem at this point in the Yom Kippur service, like what's it doing here? What's it here to teach us? And the last question, I guess, would be, what is the relevance of this poem to the modern reader? Wanting to provide more context for the modern reader, most Machzor publishers added other readings to accompany the Ayla Eskara poem. Readings and poems providing portraits of Jews killed in other historical persecutions, such as pogroms, the Crusades, and the Holocaust. Maybe it was the Crusades in terms of history, the Crusades first and the pogroms next, I would think. So I looked in a couple of different Machzorim as we were planning this time, and some of them include all the stories, but most of them don't include all the stories. It just gets to be a bit much, I guess. But what a lot of people have done is what our book does, which is to add stories of more contemporary Jews who are acting courageously to pursue justice. So we're going to look at those, and then these are the questions to think about. What are we to take from these stories? Were our sages braver than we are? Is the purpose of this poem to encourage us to consider what constitutes a meaningful death? But I would say no to that. I would think it would be to encourage us to consider and pursue a more meaningful life, but that doesn't mean that we're supposed to be martyrs. So there's that tension there. These stories are meant to inspire us, but not to suggest that we should put our lives at risk. But maybe in light of what we've been talking about, what I talked about last night, and specifically about what do we do, how do we act out our call to pursue justice, and how do we live out our Jewish values? So let's look at some of these stories and see what we think. So Rabbi Lakas, if you want to join me, we're going to look on page 517 and do a little bit of the liturgy and then some of the stories. So on 517, at the top, for these I weep, my eyes flow like streams of water, for a comforting presence is far from me, the one who restores my soul. And turning the page, let's read this together. These I remember, the ones whose lives were shaped by a mitzvah, you must not remain indifferent. The ones who lost their lives through devotion to a mitzvah, justice you shall pursue. The ones who embodied through deed and dedication a mitzvah, choose life. And these I remember, the ones who mended the broken, brought healing to the wounded, fought back despair with the solace of faith. The ones who breathed life into a prayer, the Taken Olam B'Malchut Shaddai, to establish in the world the sovereignty of high and noble purpose. I remember these, artists of the soul, architects of redemption, the activists and advocates of justice and beauty, exemplars of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. On this holy day, we remember. So we're going to begin by remembering Yosef Romano. But before we do that, I just want to point out that the line in the middle of the page, L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, that's to repair the world. I don't know how to exactly translate it. With high and noble purpose. That's how it's translated on the bottom. That's in the Aleinu, in a part that we usually skip. So interesting, right, that we skip it. That is the source of the word tikkun olam, but when we do Aleinu, even when we add the shehu noteh shamayim part on it, we still skip that line that says l'taken olam b'malchut shaddai, which is fascinating given that tikkun olam and repair is such an important part of Reformed tradition. So on this holy day, we'll remember, and we're beginning with Yosef Romano on page 526. Before we start, does anyone know who Joseph Romano was?
We didn't either until we read this page. Yosef Romano represented the state of Israel and the Jewish people on the world stage as an Olympic athlete. Born in Benghazi, Libya in 1940, Romano immigrated with his family to British Mandatory Palestine at age 6, amidst the terror caused by Muslim massacres against the Jews of Tripoli and 5 other Libyan communities in July 1945 and January 1946. 2 decades later, Romano fought on the Golan Heights in the Six-Day War, and in Munich, he fought back against Palestinian terrorists who had taken Israeli wrestlers and weightlifters hostage. Romano, a weightlifter, was a member of the Israeli team in the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich. "This is my last competition," he said, of his athletic career on September 4th of that year. "I don't have enough time for my children." 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team were taken hostage and murdered in the massacre by Black September terrorists on September 5, 1972. Though suffering from a ruptured tendon of the knee, Yosef Romano resisted the assailants in an effort to save the lives of his teammates. He was murdered early in the siege. Courage, according to a friend, was his religion. Lo tuchal lehitalem. You must not remain indifferent.
Chana Senesh is on the next page. You know a little bit more about her. She was a native of Budapest, Hungary, who made Aliyah to the British Mandatory Palestine in 1939. 5 years later, having trained as a paratrooper, Senesh was one of 37 Jews who parachuted behind German lines in an attempt to rescue Hungarian Jews destined for Auschwitz. During her 3 months in Europe with partisan resistance fighters, she wrote the prayerful poem, "Blessed is the Match." It was her last. Captured and tortured, and having refused a blindfold, Chana Senesh was executed by a Nazi firing squad in 1944 at the age of 23. She's buried in a special section of the military cemetery on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, where the gravestones are arranged in the shape of a parachute. Blessed is the match consumed in a kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that softly burns in a heart's secret place. Blessed the hearts that, like flickering lights, knew to flutter and die without shame. Blessed is the match consumed in a kindling flame. Hillel teaches, "B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel liot ish." In a place where there is no human beings, where there are no human beings, strive to be human. Some of you may have been in that prison in Israel. I went to visit that prison at one point in Israel where she was, and it was a pretty grim place.
And on page 529, Rabbi Regina Jonas has recently we've been hearing much about her in that she is thought to be the first ordained woman rabbi in Germany. And this year, as we've celebrated, yes?
There was an article in the Times about her.
So what that was, Les said there was an article in the New York Times about her. New York Times has been doing a series of people who didn't have obituaries in the New York Times. Mm. So it's a big... Right. So the reason that they picked that the Times did the story with obituary, as I said, so the New York Times does these big, beautiful news obituaries, but only some people get one of those. And So they're going through and doing and making obituaries for people who never had that kind of big news obituary. And Rabbi Regina Jonas was one, because she was the first ordained woman rabbi. And she was, and you're going to see that she didn't live through the Holocaust. And so in this year of our movement, celebrating the anniversary of the first ordination of a woman 50 years ago in May, Regina Jonas's name keeps popping up because she's not part of our story. We always start telling the story with Sally Priesand in 1972, but really we need to tell the story beginning with Rabbi Jonas, because she was really the first.
Mm-hmm. Rabbi Regina Jonas saw life as a journey of faith and service to people. God has placed abilities and callings in our hearts without regard to gender. Thus, each of us has the duty, whether man or woman, to realize those gifts God has given. Born in Berlin in 1902 and ordained in 1935, Jonas was a religious pioneer, the first woman in Jewish history to hold the title of rabbi. But her rabbinic studies and ordination occurred just as the darkness of Nazism overshadowed the greatness of achievements like hers. Reared in poverty, Jonas gravitated to those in need, the poor, the ill, the elderly. Perhaps because of her empathy and her belief in the intrinsic value of every life, she clung to an optimistic worldview that integrated spirituality, theology, and service to others, even in the midst of the gathering storm. Jonas chose to remain in Germany to serve her people. Subjected to forced labor by the Nazis in 1941 and imprisoned in the Theresienstadt concentration camp in 1942, her calling as a rabbi grew stronger under duress. Of Regina Jonas, it has been said, her synagogue was everywhere. She wanted to stay where her people were, just like Rabbi Leo Beck. Regina Jonas came to the rabbinate for two reasons: my belief in the godly calling and my love for people. She served the Jews of Germany as a teacher, pastoral caregiver, and interpreter of Jewish tradition until she was murdered in Auschwitz in October 1944. Uvacharta b'chaim l'ma'an tihiyeh ata v'zarecha. Choose life so that you and your children may live.
We'll also include Yitzhak Rabin on the next page. Born in Jerusalem in 1922, Rabin served as an Israeli military leader and twice as prime minister. As a statesman, he worked assiduously for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994. Upon signing the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn on September 13, 1993, he said, "Let me say to you, the Palestinians, we are destined to live together on the same soil in the same land. We, the soldiers who have returned from battle stained with blood, we who have seen our relatives and friends killed before our eyes, we have attended their funerals and cannot look into the eyes of their parents. We who have come from a land where parents bury their children, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians. We say to you today in a loud and clear voice, enough of blood and tears, enough. We have no desire for revenge. We harbor no hatred toward you. We, like you, are people who want to build a home, to plant a tree, to live side by side with you, in dignity and empathy as human beings, as free people. We are today giving peace a chance and again saying to you, let us pray that a day will come when we will say, enough, farewell to arms." I love how he quotes Hemingway and the Beatles, and probably other people. On July 26, 1994, Rabin spoke before the United States Congress. I, serial number 30743, Lieutenant General in Reserves Yitzhak Rabin, a soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces and in the Army of Peace, I who have sent armies into fire and soldiers to their death, say today, we sail onto a war which has no casualties, no wounded, no blood, nor suffering. It is the only war which is a pleasure to participate in, the war for peace. On November 4th, 1995, at a peace rally in Tel Aviv, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a radical Jewish opponent of his plan for peace. A blood-stained photocopy of the song Shir LaShalom, a song for peace, was found in his pocket. Lo tuchal lehitalem, you must not remain indifferent. And the song of peace is on the next page. In the bottom, Ayla Eskara of page 531. Let's read together. On Yom Kippur, the voice of sacred history calls to us. These you shall remember, their lives, their deaths, their legacy. Their legacy is in your hands. So with that last sentence, that their legacy is in our hands, I kind of wonder, given it's a hard medium here, but if anyone has any thoughts about that, like how do we, what do we do with this? What do we do with this legacy? And you can say anything you want or nothing, which is also fine. But in terms of like the people that are included or the whole idea of this, does it have a place on Yom Kippur? Yeah. We have to work to fulfill. So Richard said, we have an obligation to work to fulfill their mission. Now, can I push you a little bit? Is it because they were Jewish, or because these particular people had a particular cause that we should be, that we should also pick up? Richard is saying that that we have this history of martyrdom, history of people being killed for no other reason other than they're Jewish, and it's our job to tell their stories. Our families, probably most of us are the lucky ones because our grandparents were less patient, or there was just an article about that. They were less patient, or they were more nervous, or they didn't wait for things to get really bad before they left. And that's why we're here. Can you hear it? It was talking about our commitment to immigrants, to reaching out to people to bring them into our country, to make them feel welcome, just to let them be here. That HIAS, it used to be called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, was active when our grandparents, great-grandparents, whoever was coming to this country, was Jews, to integrate people, and also just to work that they would get here. That is why the murderer who went to Tree of Life that day came, because Tree of Life had publicly said that they were doing a HIAS service. I mean, many people don't know this because there weren't that many people there the night before, but the night before that, I guess it was October 26th, I also spoke about immigration, but I didn't tell anybody that I was doing it. So we didn't have it published that we were going to be talking about immigration that night. But the next day they did, or he knew about what they were doing at Tree of Life. He didn't know what we were doing here. Yeah, Amy.
I think legacy, can you hear me?
Yeah, Barry,
I
yes.
think legacy in our hands gives us implicit permission to take what they did in a way that's safe in our time, but is sort of a mandate to do something.
We have a mandate to do something, not necessarily what they did.
We have to finish it. Yeah. I think what's inspiring to me is that these people weren't necessarily famous people, right? They were ordinary people who were elevated by their deeds, and in our memories of them, we recall what they did and realize what a difference they made. But I think that not only are we mandated to continue the work that they started, however we define that, but also just to remember that each of us has the potential to really do something powerful and to do something with our lives that those who we read about were not able to do.
And one of the things I think is interesting about the people that they chose to put in this book, for example, Daniel Pearl and they mention, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schorner. Those were the three that were killed when they went into the South in 1964 to help with voting rights, and they were killed. So they were, I think in that case, they weren't doing a particularly Jewish thing, but they grew up in homes or in synagogues hearing the message of
Jewish values
of equal rights and so they had that was part of who they were, and so they were killed in the process. But they weren't particularly they weren't Jewish activists. They were activists who were Jewish, and so that's actually an interesting thing about this book. So it looks as if we have people coming in for Yizkor, which is fine. So it's 10 after 4. The choir is going to gather. Thank you for being part of this little experiment. We just wanted to really see what this part of the liturgy was like, and so thank you for being here for part of that. So Yizkor will begin at 4:30. The choir is going to start coming in, and people will start coming in, but you get the good seats.